We're starting with this new podcast once again, MindFit. My name is Robert Aceves, and I have Neil Babins here with me. How you doing, Neil?
Doing very well. How about yourself?
Doing great. Had a really good weekend. Worked a lot. Did a lot of great things with people, and then I heard you had a really good weekend too.
Oh, it was wonderful. I was up in Sequoia on a camping trip with some friends, and we went hiking up to Emerald Lake. It was a 14-mile round-trip hike, and had some deer come fairly close to us, so comfortable with people, which was kind of odd, I thought. But got some great pictures. It was just amazing and exhausting, but beautiful. Really nice, though.
That's awesome. Well, today we are going to be talking about narcissism. Last week we were talking about enlightenment and self-actualization, and there were actually some people that asked us some questions about that, and we really appreciate the questions, by the way. You're welcome to send us comments or questions anytime. And one of the things, that we were talking about, or that asked us, is if when you talk about self-actualization or enlightenment, what makes it different than narcissism? When do we say that someone's narcissistic, and when is someone not narcissistic? And we both feel, we talked about this in the past too, that a lot of people use the term narcissism a lot in the society today. But let's define that term more so that we can clarify some things in our minds. What do you think?
Yeah, well, narcissism is overused, definitely. It's become a pop culturalized word, so people sort of throw it out there like they throw out depressed when they're sad, or when they're overly organized, they call themselves OCD. When somebody is really into themselves or practicing a lot of self-care or being self-assertive, they sometimes mistake that for being narcissistic. When somebody is confident or sure of their opinion, or likes to think of themselves first, oftentimes we throw around the word narcissism. But it's funny because in work as therapists, in clinical work, we often talk about exuding boundaries, drawing your line in the sand, knowing what your deal breakers are, putting yourself first. And I've actually had therapists say, and myself have said to clients, it's okay to be a little bit selfish.
Right.
When people are questioning that. And they ask that question, when does it become narcissism? Well, narcissism to me, from a clinical perspective, is when you've pervasively and ongoingly closed off any other opinions or input as being as having any value over yours. You will have a lack of empathy. Is typically when we talk about the classic narcissistic personality disorder, full-blown. It's a lack of empathy that really what we're talking about. Unable to see things from other people's point of view, and even if you can, closing it off is even a possibility, taking that in. And there are other, criteria as well, but I won't go into all that. Just that, I think a lack of empathy would be the key for me. So it's not a question of whether you're putting yourself first, being healthily selfish, or being self-actualized. It's a question of whether you at the same time do not have any empathy for anybody else's point of view or feelings. You could feel badly about asserting yourself in a certain way, feel badly about how somebody else might take that, but you're still not going to let that stop you from doing what you need to do. But at the same time, you're going to acknowledge the fact that somebody else might be hurt or feel a sense of loss over it. So that's having, empathy for the situation. And I think to me, that's the difference between narcissism and self-actualizing.
Right. So last week we talked about how self-actualization would be, like reaching your full potential as a human being, right? Mm-hmm. And enlightenment, I said that it's more like very similar to self-actualization, but I would say is more of a spiritual thing when you reach your full potential as a spiritual being. Now, the difference between what you just said in narcissism and being self-actualized or enlightened, I would say is exactly what you just said. When you have more empathy towards other people and you realize that you're connected to others, you're not just, a single individual living on this planet, and you can really see other people's feelings and emotions and connect with them in a different level. I feel like that would be more someone who's self-actualized or enlightened, right? Mm-hmm. Or what do you think?
I do, because if you don't have empathy for others, if you're not connected to others, then self-actualization sort of implodes on itself. Because if you're trying to make yourself the best person you possibly can be, you're going to end up an island. Mm-hmm. A very strong island which is really a key component to loneliness. Because, that's probably a whole other podcast in itself, but loneliness really is not a state of being alone. As the famous psychologist Sue Johnson often says, loneliness is a state of seeing the world as being the world being in a state of constant threat to you in some way. So if you are, blocking off connectedness and empathy, you're self-actualizing, but to what avail? To what consequence? You're going to be by yourself. You may be successful, but no connection to anyone else around you. So to me, that's a recipe for loneliness and emptiness, as opposed to how could you be self-actualized if you're doing it completely by yourself? Survival is one thing, safety and survival at the bottom level of Maslow's needs is one thing. But if you're all by yourself and you're successful and you're safe, but you're not connected, are you okay with that? Is a question you want to ask yourself, I would think.
Mm-hmm. Also, I think when people work on themselves, and they're being selfish, like you said, because it's okay to be selfish sometimes and be assertive and take your time to be with yourself. I feel like there's some kind of peace that comes from that, and there's a difference between being selfish for improvement reasons and we trying to be a better person versus being narcissistic, where you're only thinking of yourself and you're taking away from other people. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. I think that sometimes we're caught up in relationships in our life. We have to take a close look at that, at people who are trying to use the concept of narcissism because it's so culturalized and selfishness to draw us back into an old pattern of being. Sometimes in our families or in our friend circles, there are certain energies that try to resist change in us. And so they try to draw us back into our old pattern of being, and they use concepts like guilt, obligation, fear, you're being narcissistic, you're being selfish, you're being ungrateful, as ways to try to draw you back into what they're more comfortable with you being, the role that they've assigned you. So there's a lot of power and energy that has to go behind making these changes for yourself, because you're going to go up against a lot of resistance. And that's where I think people can start to think, am I being narcissistic? Am I being selfish? Am I, not having empathy? Sometimes when you draw your line in the sand, in order to take care of yourself, self-care, you sometimes have to be quite strong. Quite strong to that resistance. And sometimes that's a difficult thing for some people who have been internalized over the years to be passive or to give in or to think that anything that they're doing that is self-related is selfish. But I think that's where the holding the fort when you're being bombarded is really the hardest part. Knowing that your fort is worth saving. It doesn't mean that you don't have empathy for other people. You want to have empathy for other people, but you need them to have empathy for you. And if you're not getting that kind of empathy that you need, sometimes you need to claim it, And other people are not necessarily going to be happy with you. And that has to be okay with people sometimes, You're not doing it with the intent of making people unhappy. You're doing it with the intent of taking care of you. And I think that's the difference.
Okay. Now, could you give us some examples of people that you've met that have been true narcissistic people so we can get an idea of what it really is to be a narcissist?
I have known some people who have full-blown, clinically narcissistic personality disorder. I've known some people who I would say have a lot of narcissistic traits, because in the field, there are various different personality disorders, but to make it a full-blown criteria, a lot of things have to be met at the same time. But a lot of us have traits of a lot of the personality disorders. So examples of people that I've known, can't use their names, but
right. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I have known, sure. They are unable to see the world through somebody else's perspective. They have, like I said, a very acute lack of empathy. Generally a short fuse if they're challenged. So if you challenge their point of view or you challenge their position, they become extremely reactive, and will often either shut you out or come back with a further levels of attack. Their point of view is the best point of view, and it's the only point of view. And if you don't see it their way, you're just wrong. And they're also, the underlying feeling is fear. Of course, they're afraid of not being correct, but they have an inability to sort of look outside of themselves, and sort of a grandiosity, a great sense of grandiosity about their points of view, about their accomplishments, about their potential, about who they are, about what they can do. Nothing can touch them. And if it tries to touch them, they will just, like I said, come back with a poignant reactivity. And what people also should understand about narcissistic personality disorder, any personality disorder, it's not organic. You're not born with it. It's generally developed over time through your upbringing, through development, through internalized messages, through feedback over the years. You can have a predisposition for it, perhaps, but you're not going to develop it full blown unless certain things happen to you in your childhood and adolescence that sort of make it so. So it's not, you don't just wake up one morning and decide to do something for yourself and you're a narcissist. It doesn't happen like that.
Right.
Yeah.
So would you say, I mean, the way it sounds to me sometimes is like it's someone, because it's hard to tell, when someone's confident versus someone who's, narcissistic, because I feel like, I mean, you can be narcissistic and be very confident and know that you're always right and the way you do things is always right. But at what point does it become narcissism, and what point is it confidence? And is there a threshold where we could say, okay, this is where it becomes unhealthy, and this is where you need to, step back and think, if you're narcissistic, for example? Yeah,
no, that's a great question, because when I say empathy, in being involved with confidence, if a person is very confident, but they're also not curious, if they're confident, but they're also not connected to themselves and to others, if they're also not courageous enough to be wrong when that possibility is there, if confidence is not mixed with a certain amount of vulnerability and openness, then that's bridging on a narcissistic kind of a trait. So you could be confident, but you should also remain curious. Is my point of view coming across? Is there another way to look at this? How is it that somebody else sees the exact same event and sees it differently? Can I understand their point of view, where they're coming from? Can I be courageous enough to be wrong? Even if I'm confident about being right. So if those elements are there, then that's less narcissistic, obviously, And that's very important that you brought that up, because those are the elements of empathy: being connected to others, being courageous, and being curious about everything, even if you are sure. People who draw conclusions and stick by them and then want to knock down all their enemies who think differently, I think we could all think in history. There are a few public figures in history that we can think of. Tyrants are basically, tyrannical leaders. Autocrats are very often coming across with a narcissistic personality. So that's to give you an example. They don't remain curious about other points of view. In fact, they lock them up.
Right. Also, I've noticed one thing that I don't know if this connects or not, but selfies. I know a lot of people who love to take selfies, and they just constantly taking pictures of themselves over and over. And I understand once or twice a day. But there are people who spend their entire days. Not recently, when I was in Ecuador, I remember going to this pool, and this girl was maybe around 20 or 18, laying down by the pool where I was there for probably a couple hours. I was just relaxing, and the whole time she was taking pictures of herself and selfies. And so I wonder, is that a disease? Is that part of being narcissistic, or is that just a separate thing?
Well, at the root of narcissism, pure narcissism now, not just, the pop culturalized term, is insecurity, is a great fear of not being enough, of being inadequate. So oftentimes, I don't know what the story of this girl was, but
neither do I.
Yeah. No, but oftentimes, people who are very, very into themselves in that way are actually afraid that on a deep-rooted level that what they're hoping is true of themselves is not true. So it comes from insecurity. Sometimes that kind of narcissism, if you want to call it that, is sort of confused with what we call histrionic personality. So drawing attention to the self, exhibitionism. If a person is doing something in order to draw attention to themselves and being overly dramatic about it, oftentimes that can be a little bit bridged with narcissism. So that's, something to that could have been what was going on as well, drawing attention to herself. Liking what you see in the mirror, especially if you've worked hard to get it, is not narcissism. Even if you are very into the way you look, it really depends on, what it's coming from. It doesn't mean that you have no empathy for others. But after a certain point, I would start to question if you have such an emphasis on, yourself and the way you look, for example, taking pictures of yourself, is something else going on underneath? Is there an underlying feeling that you're trying to sort of not look at by being that attentive to yourself? And, that could be at the root of what people who have full-blown narcissism have as well. So it's hard to know. I'd have to see the girl doing it to be sure. Yeah.
Okay. What about recognition? There are some people who really want their name to be put on something or, donate a lot of money for, like when I went to UC Irvine, there were a lot of families that very wealthy here in Orange County, and they would donate, millions, and they would do it just so that building has their name on it, or that, they get some kind of recognition at the end of the year. I understand some of it is okay, but there are people who really love their names. Would that be narcissism?
That comes up a lot because especially we're living in a town that is just, polished with an industry or several industries that people want recognition. I often say this to a lot of my clients who are in that industry. I say to them, I remind them, when you look, we'll just use acting as an example. When you look at actors on stage or on screen or on TV or wherever you look, the actors that you're typically drawn to the most, that you actually admire the most on a visceral level, are typically the actors who do a wonderful job at what they're doing, but also have a vulnerability. They have a human connection. There's a part of them, and a significant part of them, that wonders if they even have this together. They reflect you when you look at them. They're not trying to run away from their vulnerabilities by being a successful actor or artist or whatever they're trying to do. They're actually trying to make sense of them. They're using them. They're actually holding the hands of their vulnerable selves when they're portraying what they're portraying. You could see it. You could sense it. And then there are those that are forcibly looking for recognition. They're trying to run away, in my opinion, from those parts of themselves that are hurting the most and are wounded. They're using them, but they're trying to compartmentalize them as opposed to actually being with them. So there's a difference. And if somebody is, spending money just to have their name on a wall or a plaque or something like that, again, that could be coming from, fear, insecurity. And, is it full-blown narcissism? No, but it could be a narcissistic trait. It's on the fence.
I mean, I think sometimes it's the ego thing too, where you want your name to last forever, and you want after you're gone, people to still remember who you are and say your name, and that causes some kind of pleasure in your ego. Knowing that you're doing something to help others, but at the same time, I want that recognition that I did it, that it was me who provided this or that. Also, as you were saying this, what would you say is like the opposite of narcissism?
Oh, the opposite of narcissism. Well, probably dependency. Having a person who is a dependent personality, who has no sense of self, no sense of value, no sense of worth, who downplays everything, who is actually beyond humble, who's just is very uncomfortable with any kind of recognition or any kind of gratification, who always second guesses themselves, who lets other people make decisions for them. It's probably on the opposite spectrum of it. Yeah, I mean that's also coming from fear, because if you expose yourself and you become recognized, then what do you do now? People are looking at you, so there's all that insecurity underneath as well. It all basically stems from similar core emotions of fear and or sadness, and just how it manifests differently on a spectrum. Would be the opposite of narcissism.
So it sounds like, it would be a perfect match. Someone who's codependent with the narcissist.
You often see that.
Right?
You often see that. You see somebody who is dependent in a certain way with somebody who has narcissistic traits. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, you do.
That's funny.
Yeah. Yeah, you see a lot in relationships, actually. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. Yeah, and, wanting, like, going back to wanting the recognition, wanting to accomplish something, and you said be known forever. Interestingly, there's a certain amount, I think personally, this is not clinical, but it's just my personal opinion, I think that a certain amount of everybody has a certain amount of ego, mm-hmm. where we would like our work to go down in time, to have an impact, mm-hmm. To have an influence that goes beyond our life. I don't think that's narcissism at all. Is it ego? Sure, but it's a healthy ego. But I think what happens is that the people who try to do what they do so that their name will continue are probably burning themselves out. And even if people do recognize what they've done, there's going to be a marginal amount of people who recognize it, as opposed to somebody who's really coming from themselves and sure has the dream of having their legacy continue, but they're really using their vulnerability. They're really using themselves in their work. They're passionate about their work, and they're really connected to themselves and others. Has, in my opinion, more of a likelihood of passing on legends. I mean, if you look at legendary people, some of them are in this industry are legendary because they're famous, and some of them are legendary because they're legends. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a very big difference. Celebrity is not the same thing as being a legend, in my opinion.
Right. So would you say somewhere in between narcissism and being codependent would be like a happy medium, like a heal person, normal? I don't know if you can use the term normal, but someone who would be a healed narcissist, I guess, or someone who is just living a life where, yes, they want some recognition, but it's not like that's the only purpose of their lives, where they can also connect and empathize with other people and have a normal life, in the sense that they're functioning correctly, doing things for others and themselves, and have some kind of, like we said at the beginning, being self-actualized, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that both narcissism and dependency, going on both sides of the spectrum, are coming from extremes. Mm-hmm. They're polarized parts of self. They're they're usually covering up other feelings that a person is not willing to be with in order to avoid it or distract from it. Mm-hmm. So, they go to either dependency or narcissism. So can you be healed somewhere in the middle? Well, you do it all the time when you practice, mindfulness and meditation, and the idea of being in the core of yourself. You can check in with all your different parts of self at any time. Right. So if there's a part of you that's going over and above confidence, you could check in with that part of you that is a little bit egotistical, perhaps even a little bit narcissistic, and say, okay, I need you to calm down here. And you could look at your part of yourself that's being a little bit dependent and letting others, walk over you or make decisions for you, and say, okay, I need you to tone that down a little bit here. So you sort of in your core. So you don't ever really want to be, a healed dependent or a healed narcissist. You want to become core, authentic, balanced in the middle, where you can watch all those parts of you, because you're going to need them at some point. Sometimes, like I said, if you want to be a little bit selfish, sometimes, maybe in very, very rare instances, you'll want to be the kind of, have a narcissistic part that says, I don't care what you think. This is the way it's going to go. And I'm not interested if anyone's feelings are hurt. And there are moments where you might stand in that position, but they're rare, right? But you want to hold on to those traits, those parts of you, but never let them lead. Do you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And that's when it's, that's what I think. So they can't be extreme. So you don't want to heal that part of yourself as much as you want to become, like you said, balanced in the core, so you could manage all those parts of you.
Yeah. When you were saying that, it reminds me of, being a writer, for example, or some kind of artist where you create something, from nothing, and it's your creation, right? And you want it to be a certain way, but then if you allow other people to come in and start, messing with it, before you know it, it's no longer your creation. It's somebody else's creation now.
Right.
That started from your idea. But, that's what sometimes I think it's important to be selfish or, narcissistic, like you just said. But then there's times when, it's also important to connect and to really, we want to have a relationship and we want to be able to understand our partners. We need to let go of ourselves sometimes and to really understand where they're coming from, right? So there's times, I guess, where you can wear your coat of narcissism and sometimes it's better to take it off, right?
Yeah. Well, that's a good analogy, a writing project, for example, because if you remain open, if you remain in your core, somebody might have a brilliant idea about your work that your mind could never have gone to without an input from somebody else. It doesn't mean you're less intelligent or less a good a writer. In fact, it means you're, in my opinion, a better writer because you're open to hearing feedback that is just, brilliant. So you're absolutely right. And sometimes you want to defend in a healthy way when someone's not quite getting what your mission statement was, what your theme was, what your purpose was in writing the piece. So you want to remain in your core so that you can listen with curiosity to everyone's input and say, okay, well, thank you for that, but that's not quite what I'm looking to do. And as opposed to, wow, that's a really brilliant idea, and expanding upon that. As a writer myself, both of fiction and self-help, some of my most brilliant ideas have come from feedback from other people based on what I had proposed. And some people have, like you just said earlier, tried to, I wouldn't say sabotage it, but, come in with like, no, that's not what I'm, and you're exactly right. That's exactly when I have to become confident, and you're right. Some people might take that as narcissism if I put my foot down and say, look, that's not what this play or that's not what this book is about, They might say, well, he's just hard to work with. He's just narcissistic. Like, no. I think, you could be hard to work with, too, if you're not accepting feedback from the feedback, So, yeah, it's like a tennis match.
Yeah. I think it's, like you said, it's a healthy balance. I like that sentence you said because I feel like, like we talked about self-diagnosing, sometimes, we read all these disorders and we have a little bit of all of them. But then, when they start becoming a problem is when we get diagnosed with it because, we're doing it too much. So if you're too narcissistic all the time, you may never get any ideas, done because you're set in your ways and maybe nobody wants to work with you or hear you out. But if you're, balanced and sometimes you allow some feedback and sometimes you don't, things may be different. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you are full-blown narcissistic, for example, one of the only ways that you can continue to be to live in your reality is to have a sense of power, because, without that power, people will question you, and that's unacceptable to the true narcissist. So power is important, authority is important, so that no one can question you, and if they question you, you have the power to get rid of them in whatever way you do. So that's a trait of a narcissistic person. But somebody can be, very confident and firm and rigid, but still, allow other people to give them feedback and not just their direct aids, so to speak, but somebody can, give them feedback and they can at least be curious, at least for 5 seconds. Like, a good CEO listens for 5 seconds of it. Okay, thanks, but no, and moves on. But they listened.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Any last words before we finish? We're almost out of time.
Yeah. Again, I would reiterate, like we said last time, don't self-diagnose. Don't call people narcissists left and right and center. Don't call yourself this or that left, right, and center. A word of caution again, self-diagnosing can be dangerous. It really can, especially when people take it to the level of like when they start using medications on their own or, making decisions on their own based on what they think they have. Get diagnosed, get evaluated, and get a second and third opinion if you're going clinically into that. Don't throw that term around without knowing what it truly means. And if you want, read the DSM. You could open it up it's not that hard to understand. Read the criteria and see. And a lot of people do that, and they say, "Oh yeah, that's me." Yeah, but careful of doing that too. You know what I'm saying? Careful of doing that too, because it has to reach a certain level of extremeness and polarity for that to be true and very pervasive. So. Yeah. Don't just use loose terms.
And like I said earlier, sometimes you're reading this stuff and you automatically assume you have it just because you're reading on it, and it, there's suggestions and you're getting suggested by it, and somehow your mind starts acting that way. But it doesn't mean that you have it, necessarily.
No. I could tell you you're a Capricorn, then you'll go read Capricorn. You go, that's me. I could tell you're an Aries, you'll go read Aries. Oh, that's me. Right. But I'm not minimizing astrology. I'm just saying, that's that. You're right. It's a mindset.
Yeah. Our minds are really powerful. Well, thank you so much, Neil. And my suggestion would be also to continue to work on yourself, to reach that self-actualization, to reach enlightenment. I feel like, we know each other, or we know ourselves better than anybody else. So if you work through meditation or any other form that you use to, go inside and to really get to know yourself, I think that would be one of the best ways to really know who you are and where you come from and where you're going and all those questions that we all have at some point in our lives. So thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you next week at the same time. Remember, this is MindFit, and I'm Robert Aceves, and this is Neil Babins, and we'll be hearing from you again. So send your questions. You can find us at any of the platforms for podcasting, Spotify, Apple Podcast, or Anchor, which is the one we're using right now. So thank you again, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.
All right. See you later.
This podcast is brought to you by MindFit. Please help us to share this podcast with your friends and family to grow this community. And if you'd like to donate to this podcast, or if you'd like to share your comments, questions, or concerns, send them to mindfitpodcast@gmail.com, or you can call us directly at 714-328-4661.